We got most people in there now. All right, good morning, folks, and welcome back for some of you. My name is Jerrod Bley, and I serve as ANCA's Clean Energy Program Director. I'd like to welcome you all to the final session of On-Ramp. Thank you for joining us this morning for the closing plenary, report out, and panel discussion on opportunities and local benefits. This segment will wrap up nearly a week of informative presentations and robust community conversations around clean transportation, options that can be leveraged to make the New York Olympic region more resilient, more sustainable, and more appealing for the 2023 World University Games and beyond. Our vision for this event is to establish the foundation for an inclusive, region-wide transition to a low-carbon transportation future. We realize for some folks this may be your first point of entry into on-ramps, so before we begin, I do have a few background and housekeeping announcements I'd like to make really quick. First, ANCA is an independent nonprofit corporation with a transformational approach to building prosperity across northern New York. With community-informed, boots-on-the-ground strategies, we seek to keep wealth and value in our local communities. ANCA's clean energy program is driven by the understanding that investment in resilient energy systems, including grid and transportation infrastructure, build on rural traditions of self-reliance while providing significant environmental and health benefits. Please note that these sessions will be recorded and made available after the event has finished. While we begin each day with video on, participants' microphones and video will be turned off during speaker presentations. Please utilize the chat box feature at the bottom of your screen to send in questions. And when we get to the panel discussion on the second half of the morning, we do highly encourage you to ask any questions. Excuse me. If you'd like to update your name or add pronouns, click on the participant button at the bottom of your screen and scroll over to your name and select rename. There are no scheduled breaks during this session, so if you need to step away from your computer at any time, please feel free to do so. Next, I want to recognize and thank the organizations that have made this event possible through their generous support. First, to our partners at the state of New York. These are NYSERDA, the New York Power Authority, and New York Green Bank. And to our sponsors, our session sponsor is National Grid. Our roadmap sponsors are Community Bank, Hodgson Russ LLP, and Novabus. And our plug-in sponsors are Clarkson University, International Paper, and Lion Electric. Now we're going to jump into the first half of our morning and give each moderator from last week's working group sessions an opportunity to summarize the content and key findings that emerged from their respective sessions, as well as provide a few recommendations moving forward. We also have Eric Bacchus from Clarkson University, who will share his insights from the 2 community needs sessions conducted on Tuesday and Friday of last week. First up this morning is Joel Wood from NAmTrans, who moderated the working group, our first working group on vehicle needs. So Joel, if you are ready to go, I will pass the mic off to you.
That sounds great, Jerrod. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
You sound good.
Perfect. Well, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone had a nice weekend. So last Wednesday, we held our first working group, which was on vehicle needs, moving goods, moving people. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Lexi, if you want to forward to the next slide. Perfect. Oh, yep. So I was the moderator. I'm with NAmTrans, and I'll go over that in just a second, who we are and what we do. But we had a great group of panelists with us. Tony Vetrano from the North Country Sports Council, Ben Mandel from CALSTART Northeast, Jennifer Wallace Brodeur from the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and James Simon from the Department of Environmental Conservation. And each of them contributed a key part of this conversation, which again, I'll touch on in just a second. Lexi, next slide. So the goal of this session was to examine the vehicle needs that were going to be needed for the 2023 games and the resources that are available to meet the needs. So we had those panelists, those experts that I just mentioned. And before we started logically, right? So we started with what the population looked like for the games. And then we went into what vehicle needs are what are the needs of vehicles for the games. And then we went into what's available. and how do we fund and get those vehicles here in time for the games? And we talked about best practices for that. We had a lot of conversation that overlapped with probably some of the other working groups, which was keeping in mind vehicle charging, things of that nature. Lexi, next slide. So as the moderator, I kicked it off with a short presentation on NAmTrans. So NAmTrans stands for the North American Center of Excellence for Transportation Equipment. We're a strategic subsidiary of the North Country Chamber of Commerce, and what we do is we represent and support over 50 transportation equipment and aerospace manufacturers in upstate New York, the 7 most northern counties in upstate New York, the same region as the North Country Regional Economic Development Council. We have active working partnerships with other cluster support organizations in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and elsewhere. And really what that allows us to do is it helps us best support those manufacturers. We were actually mentored by our sister organization, the Quebec Ground Transportation Cluster in Montreal, the POL. We're a collaboration between a number of public and private entities. I'm really a one-man show here with the support of the North Country Chamber of Commerce, but we work closely with our local educational institutions such as Clarkson, Clinton Community College, our vocational schools, as well as our training providers and workforce development organizations. So if we can't provide the solution to the manufacturer, we can find someone who can. I touched briefly on why the transportation cluster is so important for our region, and one of the largest things is the number of high-paying jobs and careers that come as a result of these manufacturers being here. And I touched on the fact that a number of these companies are US subsidiaries of Canadian-based manufacturing. So a lot of their headquarters are in Canada. And the reason why that's important is because Canada is really leading the charge on the electric vehicle, electrifying transit vehicle, excuse me, I've only had one cup of coffee, on electrifying their transit vehicle fleets. There we go, got it. Many of the companies in our cluster, as a result of this, are already providing those zero emission solutions. So I went over some of those solutions that are being provided by Novabus here in Plattsburgh, such as their LFSE and LFSE Plus models. And the fact that Novabus and Prevo, partnering with BAE Systems out of Endicott, New York, are working and providing really innovative solutions, increasing the length that those vehicles can travel, how far they can go, how they perform in colder weather, and things of that nature, and how transit authorities such as the MTA are already purchasing some of these vehicles, these hybrid solutions for New York City. I kind of finished my presentation with 2 general questions, which is how can our North Country Transportation Equipment Cluster, this cluster of manufacturers, best meet the regional needs for the games? What is needed? And then how can we, the cluster, leverage the state and federal incentives that are already out there? So I posed those open-ended questions to the panel and the attendees. And really the opportunity was that we're already producing, our manufacturers are already producing these solutions. So how do we match the need with the supply? And just the fact that NAmTrans, the North Country Chamber, are here and ready and willing to assist with the electrification of these vehicles and bringing this technology for the 2023 games. Lexi, next slide. So then we turned it over to Tony, and Tony Vetrano with the North Country Sports Council went over a population modeling assessment, which was really eye-opening, which talked about how many individuals, athletes, families, spectators, media, we could expect for the 23 days of the competition. We started there because you can't really know what vehicles you need unless you know how many people and goods you might be needing to move to the region for the games, and then around the region for the games, from venue to venue. Then he showed us a vehicle needs assessment by client group. So he broke it down by which athletes for which games and which venues in terms of what sort of vehicle needs would best meet that demand. So he talked about the differences between the transit buses, electric school buses, for example, short route cargo vans, you know, even heavy freight for the games, and assigned numbers to those different population groups. So that was good too, because it showed a varied need for the games. I think a lot of folks at the beginning, when I was speaking at least, might have thought that the panel was going to be focused entirely on transit buses.
No.
But it kind of showed that there's a varied need for the games. Tony also touched on the fact that education is going to be central to this conversation, educating not only the athletes, but the spectators and the region as a whole as to what vehicles are going to be needed, and why electric vehicles are so important for the games. And he, you know, he kind of said that the planning on that level hadn't started yet, but he was looking for guidance from the community, from the organizers, and from this panel or this event. The opportunities that he talked about was that there's a legacy of clean energy infrastructure and vehicles for host communities. So we can talk to those communities who have hosted the games in the past, and also moving forward, there's an opportunity for Lake Placid to demonstrate to not only New York, but the world that we can adopt this clean energy and then utilize it in the future. So not just for the purpose of the games, but for the long run. That education piece came back again, educating the athletes, but also the local community on why this is important, and being an early adopter. So it was a really good starting point for our conversation on vehicle needs. Lexi, next slide. So after that, we turned it over to Ben Mandel, and Ben was with CALSTART Northeast. So CALSTART is a 250 plus member coalition of clean transportation organizations throughout the value chain, meaning manufacturers, you know, the different transit fleets, those who repair and perform MRO on these vehicles, the utility providers who are already implementing clean transportation solutions or who are looking to implement those clean transportation solutions. Ben talked about what's already out there. So what zero emission commercial vehicle models are already available and what are coming in the future. And he showed a really nice infographic of how those vehicles are coming in waves. So he talked about how we've kind of already reached the first wave, which is largely transit buses, how those started reaching a peak or a prevalence in 2019 and early 2020. And he started to talk about how you'll see in the next few years even more prevalence in short-term freight delivery, such as UPS, FedEx, those sorts of vans. And then how further down the road, you'll start seeing, you know, maybe 2024, 2025, a shift for heavy long truck freight delivery. So that was pretty interesting, and you're kind of seeing it, right? So here in the cluster, for example, I mentioned Nova, those transit buses, the technology is adapting and evolving very fast, and you're seeing customers already purchasing those solutions. So it's true. Ben also talked about how regions or states even have to create ecosystems of making sure that they are ready and willing to adopt these new technologies, these clean energy technologies. So you have to align a lot of different things, right? You have to align your stakeholders, you have to align your local municipalities, your state government, you have to align the local community. The financing for the vehicles and the investment, how are you going to fund them? So that was something that came up across all of the presenters, and James talked about it at the end, and I'll get to it in a second, and the regulations too. Ben did speak to the fact that California is really leading the charge on this, but New York is right on California's tail. in terms of aligning on a state level all of the things that are needed to create an environment or an ecosystem that is friendly for the adoption of these technologies. Ben did mention in terms of on the funding level and the cost of these vehicles, because time and time again we mentioned that it's tough for transit agencies or municipalities or any early adopter of these vehicles. That cost can be really off-putting. It can be a huge barrier to adoption. But Ben did mention that he believes, and CALSTART believes, that by 2025, these commercial vehicle models will be cost competitive with those internal combustion engine vehicles. So that was good to hear. And then last but not least, Ben did mention the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU that New York signed with 14 other states to develop markets for medium and heavy duty vehicles. He did touch on that, and that MOU, I'm sure many of you have seen it, calls for 30% of all new truck and bus sales to be zero emission by 2030 and then 100% by 2050. So very ambitious, but just like Ben mentioned, it's really setting New York ahead of the competition, or at least New York and these 14 other states ahead of all the others in terms of creating a friendly ecosystem. So some of the opportunities, Ben talked about their zero emission technology inventory that CALSTART has as part of their Drive to Zero program, and that ZETI can be found on their website. I believe it's CALSTART or drivetozero.org. And that ZETI allows communities who are looking to adopt this technology to find out what is available. So there are options to select what vehicle needs you might have, where you're located, when you're looking to adopt them, and it kind of tells you, okay, this is available from these manufacturers, or we're anticipating that these things will be available in the near future, so keep an eye out. So that was something that was would be a huge benefit, I think, to the games in terms of identifying what's available or what should be available in the near future. And then, you know, Ben touched on and set it up for the future presenters, some of the incentives that are out there, setting up the zero emission zones, the sales mandates, and fleet purchase requirements. Those were all things that you can do to create that friendly ecosystem to overcome some of the barriers to adoption. Lexi, next slide. After that, we turned it over to Jennifer Wallace Brodeur. Jen is with the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, and Jen covered some really important points on pilot projects that had been conducted in Massachusetts and Vermont in terms of what worked well with adopting largely transit bus or school bus, electric school bus and transit bus technology. And what she found, or what VEIC found, was that the benefits to electrification are things that we know, but are important to cover, which is reduced greenhouse gas emissions, air quality improvements, price stability for fuel, and then operational savings on the vehicles. But some of the things that they found in these pilots is that, again, the high upfront costs, right, of adopting them. A lack of awareness. This one, she said, you know, it depends on the community. But for example, when they were doing their school bus pilot, a number of the school districts hopped on board to participate. They were really excited and they knew about it. But you know, you have to know where the community is coming from and whether or not they are aware. An event like this does a great job of starting that conversation. So thank you to ANCA. One of the other barriers was the need for new partnerships. So partnering with organizations like the utilities, for example, that might not have happened in the past. Lack of local vendors in the area. Training for mechanics. That was a big one. And Jen spent some time talking about that, right? So you purchase the vehicles, you have the charging stations, you think you're set, and then something goes wrong. It's hard enough to fix a regular school bus or diesel transit bus, but making sure that you have mechanics and you know, maintenance available for the buses if something were to happen. And then Jen did touch on smaller transit vehicles as well. in addition to the transit and school buses, and how they are more affordable for locations, that it's an emerging technology, but there are places that are already using them effectively, and how that's important because the 2023 games are going to need more than transit and school buses. They will need some of these smaller vans and smaller transit vehicles. Some of the opportunities that Jen talked about. Oh, actually, one last thing, and Kate mentioned this right at the beginning, and it's important to point out, I get this question a lot, is how do school buses work in rural environments with hills and windy roads and cold temperatures? The pilots that VEIC did in Vermont and Massachusetts determined that they work just fine. I mean, really, you have to have a quality charging infrastructure in place to make sure that they're charging efficiently. And there are different ways to do that with depot charging or quick charging through like Nova Bus's op charging functions. But if you have an efficient charging infrastructure in place, they'll do just fine. This battery technology has really evolved since the first wave of electric transit and school buses. So they're on par with the old internal combustion vehicles. Some of the opportunities that Jennifer talked about, the environmental, health, and economic benefits of turning to these vehicles. We talked about that. That school buses are ideal for short trips, being able to return to the garage for depot charging, using the battery as storage. And then Jennifer set it up really, really nicely for the last speaker that we had, which was James Simon from the DEC, about the VW settlement funds to offset the purchase of these electric buses. So Lexi, next slide. So James, like I said, was from the DEC, and James talked about some of the funding incentives, right? So how do you offset the cost of this technology? It's more expensive than traditional diesel buses. So how do you offset the cost? And James talked about the VW settlement funds. So there are over $120 million in New York State as a result of VW's emission scandal to promote vehicle and equipment replacement projects and to electrify these fleets. 2/3 of the overall funding, that 128, I believe, $1 million is going towards that electrification, and that funding is still available. It took some time to get all of the programs in place, but that funding is still available. James talked about the fact that there is some scrappage requirements with this grant, but that those vehicles need to be 2009 or older, and that can be a problem sometimes, and that there are environmental justice zones that play a part in that. But really, those vehicles just have to operate in proximity to an environmental justice zone or be parked in one, and we have plenty of those in the North Country, Plattsburgh, outside Dannemora and Line Mountain, Lake Placid, Saranac Lake area, so that's not a problem. He did talk about some of those barriers too, and barriers being, if you have the ability to apply for funding through DEC or DOT or NYPA or NYSERDA, and you happen to get this funding to help offset the cost, you still have a really long timeline to procure the vehicles, right? So you have to start the process soon. You have to start it early because these vehicles aren't sitting on a lot. You don't drive by the dealership and find a brand new electric transit or school bus sitting on the lot at the dealership. They're usually built for contracts. So start the process early was one of his key recommendations. Making sure that the charging infrastructure is in place. And I know other working groups talked about that, but we touched on it a lot in ours. And then training and resistance to change, and this all goes back to the education and awareness part, but James did bring up the fact that a lot of different transit agencies and authorities that they were working with, DEC was working with, really said, we've been using diesel buses for so long, we know how they work, we know how to fix them, we know what their capabilities are, we don't want to switch. That might not be a problem for this area, but it was something that he brought up. And then James did touch on the MOU, again, that New York had signed, the same one that Ben had talked about, and how that really establishes our region as a place where these vehicles can exist and succeed. So the opportunities, again, the funding through those different state agencies to help offset the cost of adopting these vehicles, and then all the different vehicles that can be funded through those funding resources. There's a long list there at the bottom. I'm not going to read them, but the fact that this funding can also help offset the cost of charging infrastructure, which is important. And then James did mention right at the end that even though the program hasn't rolled out yet, it should be rolling out soon, which is a electric school bus funding option. And how he thought that was a really good fit for the games due to, a shorter range, a smaller cost, and then the ability for school districts after the games are over to still use these electric school buses. Lexi, next slide, please. So our working group came up with a few key bullets, and here they are. The first one, start planning early. We're having this conversation, a little over 2 years out. We're starting it, and thanks to ANCA and the sponsors of this event, we're starting it early, and that's the first step. The next one was when engaging with the manufacturers, right? So you identify what you might need based on the population assessments and the vehicle needs assessments. You use maybe the zero emission inventory through CALSTART, and you identify some manufacturers and you say, okay, I think these are the vehicles we need. Be sure that the repair and service contracts are included in those contracts that you sign with the manufacturers. Maybe that'll take some of the stress off from having to do those repair and service yourself or through a third party. Match vehicle needs with available technology. That's again through that zero emission inventory tool through CALSTART. Identify and connect with the manufacturers, planners, and incentive programs as soon as possible because that procurement process is long. So line up your funding, find out what vehicles are available, find out who can make them, start identifying, agencies or organizations who might be willing to adopt the technology locally for not only the games, but for the future. Consider sponsorship opportunities with key manufacturers. That's important in a way to help offset costs. Making sure that the mechanics and service centers are in close proximity to the games. We have some wonderful resources here locally, such as our vocational schools, all of our CV Techs and FEH EBOCs, for example, the Institute for Advanced Manufacturing at Clinton, Clarkson, who can help train these mechanics and service centers for these service centers early, but you have to do it early, right? It takes time to develop that training curriculum. So start the conversation now. The fact that smaller transit vehicles are more affordable, readily available, shuttle type vehicles may be easier to electrify. So that was something that we kind of wanted to point out. And then build in along every step of the way educational opportunities. So don't stop reaching out to the community and making them aware that this is happening. Make sure that they feel that they're not only aware, but they feel like they're included in the conversation and that they feel like that this is their decision too. That'll go a long way for not only the games, but for using these vehicles after the games are over. And then identify the process for passing vehicles off to the communities. I kind of just touched on that. So the question that we ended with, we answered some questions at the end of our workshop, but the question that we ended with is, what do the World University Game Planners need that we can provide? Meaning, not only the manufacturers, but all of these organizations, right? CALSTART, VEIC, DEC. What can we do to provide the vehicles that the university games need, and what can we do to support them long after the games are over? So that was our working group last Wednesday. It was a really great session, and thank you again to ANCA and all the sponsors for making the event possible.
Joel, thank you so much. That was an abbreviated but very thorough recap of the working group last week. And just a quick reminder, all these sessions, the working group sessions that were recorded last week will be available on ANCA's website here in the coming days. and hopefully the Clarkson community needs sessions we can have up there as well. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box or write them down and hold them until we get to the roundtable panel discussion on the second half of this morning's call here. The idea really is to take all this information that was presented last week, do a quick summary, and then get this community and local benefits panel discussion. So if you have questions, that would be the best time to really ask them, and we'll try to answer them. So next up, we have Ben Foster from Fosterra LLC, who moderated working group number 2 on charging infrastructure. And we're at 10:06. We're a little bit behind. Ben, not saying that you need to rush through things, but maybe quickly cover some of the material, and we can get on to the next presenters and then into that local benefits panel discussion. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Ben.
Great, thanks, Jerrod. I appreciate it. Hopefully you can hear me okay. We had a great session. Working group 2 was focused on charging infrastructure. So what Joel just shared was a good springboard for us to first hear from them and that group and those excellent panelists on what are the EV trends and needs for the event. And then we got to talk about the EV charging infrastructure and where and how might we think about the charging network that would be required to support not only the games, but the long-term needs of the community in the region. So Lexi, the next slide. Our goal really, we started with a reminder of what the goals for the session were. And ultimately, we think that we have a unique opportunity to advance vehicle electrification across the region. And we need to think both strategically, because this is going to be a long-term asset. You heard about the high capital costs on the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. So it's not a one-time thing where you just rent it or borrow it or a small investment. It's a big investment. So we need to think strategically, but there are these tactical opportunities. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity to host the World University Games. And this is a great opportunity for us to really think about the next innovation and demonstrate that. So how do we move quickly to take advantage of the opportunities but still position ourselves strategically longer term? So on the next slide, we started with Rebecca Hughes from NIPA. She was excellent talking about the need for DC fast charging because as people come into the region, either for a specific event or for traveling through on the way to activities they might undertake or tourist stops, that they want to be able to come in and have fast charging. And so NIPA is focused on how can they help deploy that DCFC fast charging across the different vehicle types across the region and statewide, of course, also. So it was really important to think about how that's an asset that helps to support the needs of both passenger vehicles and the heavier duty vehicles. She was also shared with us a great customer experience considerations, which is, from my personal perspective, if I'm doing a road trip across the area with the family, you don't have to stop one place for food and then a different place for someone to go to the bathroom and then a third place to go take a break and do some sightseeing and then a fourth place to go charge. How do we bring those all together? So those points of interest, those destinations, those stopping points, those waypoints, that a DC fast charger is there when you need it. So while you're in there grabbing something to eat, 20 minutes later, you've got enough charge to keep going and get to your destination and more. So she's talking about customer experience and the trends and the needs to think about that customer experience when we're planning out the fast charging networks. And then she was also sharing her experience, not only with NIPA, but previously with NYSERDA, that fortunately this market transformation, this evolution of the electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure and even the awareness is beginning to evolve and become more and more aligned with customer needs and reducing the complexity and making it simpler and easier to find charging stations and the things that as a driver you want to find. So that was a great kickoff from a customer perspective. And then Adam Reuter from NYSERDA, he shared with us more on the heavy duty side, electric buses. I think we just heard from Joel and his team that those electric buses do have a long lead time. So it's important to think through when you need it, when you might need those buses to be in service, and to think about the procurement and getting that in the pipeline. And then those, based on the vehicle's duty cycle, both daily, weekly, seasonally, those charging needs can vary. So thinking about the charging infrastructure and where it should be and how it should be delivered, that the charge itself to that bus or other heavy duty vehicle. One of the things too, and this goes to our strategic planning as well as the immediate opportunity for the games, is really thinking about what are the long-term needs and the use for these buses and transit vehicles and others, and think about that as the main driver in terms of the types of vehicles, what the use is going to be, and then back that up to say, okay, for the games, how might we begin to procure those and use those for the games? But then as soon as those games are over, those get transitioned over to the agencies or the entities that would be able to use the vehicles. So thinking about the vehicles, but then of course the infrastructure that goes along with that. And that's where the mobile charging solutions, one of the ideas was, there's a surge capacity. There's a need during the games to have extra charging because there are more people in a certain area, where that charging infrastructure that you would build out, if you were to build out permanently for the games in those locations, those venues might be over investment for the long term, whereas that could be in different locations spread out for the same investment. So how do we develop and think about a surge capacity, the ability, maybe mobile charging stations or temporary charging stations in some way for the games? And then one of the other things that came up was finding solutions to manage the demand. So for those of you who are familiar with the electrical needs of especially the higher level 2 and DC fast charging, is if a lot of people plug in all at once, it spikes the demand. There's a capacity, perhaps constraint on that local network. And so how do we manage those in a way that don't overtax the local electrical system or drive up costs so far that it becomes maybe unattractive to want to charge? So these are some things that Adam covered to help tee up the considerations for that short term and long term. And maybe Jerrod, if you can post in the box too, there's on Adam, since he's in charge of the clean transportation area, he's got tons of great resources and reports and information that I think for everyone would be very useful. So let's see, next slide. So Kevin Miller from ChargePoint, it was interesting. So then now we're talking or hearing from the manufacturers or providers of the EVSE solutions and charging networks. So Kevin broke it down into the cost barriers or the cost considerations really from 2 perspectives. One is the capital, so that's an upfront cost that you need to invest to build out the infrastructure. And then the other was the operating cost. So once it's installed, how do you think about the operating cost and what does it cost every time you want to charge and for the kilowatt hours that you're putting into those vehicles? The good thing is there are lots of programs to overcome the capital barriers, both from a state perspective and utility perspective and federal perspective, that we really locally want to be able to capture. So it's really important for everybody that's been part of this event and the outreach that's going to happen afterwards, is to think about these limited time opportunities. How do we capture the maximum benefit for our region, right? How do we go out and get that? So we want to make sure that we have that, some of those programs tailored to or focused on our build out. Also for new construction or retrofits or maybe increasing parking in certain areas or others, one of the suggestions is to make sure that that build out is EV ready. So EV ready is essentially that the power is available through trenching and conduit runs and interconnection, and available in those locations where you'd want to put on a charging station. So doing that at the time of construction or major renovation drives the costs down a lot. So you can imagine, for those of you who have seen charging stations in a parking lot in the back corner, the trenching that would be required to get that from the point of interconnection by maybe the building itself. That's expensive if it's already built, the parking lot, but it's much cheaper if you're doing it while you're building out that infrastructure. And then on an operating cost perspective, the main challenge we talked about was this demand issue again, is that demand charges that look at your maximum consumption in any given 15-minute period in any given month is really driving the cost. And in fact, the demand cost can be at or maybe even more in some cases than what your actual energy used. Because if 5 vehicles plugged in at 5 p.m., let's say they arrive for dinner or some activity, that could spike up your demand charges, even though the rest of the month the usage is spread out. So finding ways, either from a managed perspective on demand, or one of the things Kevin was talking about was, is there a way to look at the rate schedule itself, the tariff, to see if there can be an EV specific rate schedule that is taken into consideration, maybe combined with demand management of some sort. So that's really important to think through, because we want to encourage people to charge when they need to charge, but we also don't want to have it cost prohibitive. So Kevin shared with that as a way to tee up some of the cost considerations. That was really helpful. In the next slide, and we heard from Travis. He's from Flow Ed Energy, and he was joining us from Canada. And what was really interesting is he showed us, I would call it an EV SE desert that exists across the border here, south of the border. At north, they've got this great charging infrastructure. They've got broader adoption of EVs already underway. He showed us a map going out to the Gaspé Peninsula, all the way down the south shore of the St. Lawrence, that they have that electrified, and they just see continued tourist-driven activities even through COVID. So we had some recent statistics that show that if you build it, they will come, and it provides that surety that when you're trying to do the staycations and the local visits, if you have an EV, the more charging stations, the better. And then we know when we looked in our region that there's just not that many. And so how do we build that up, and why it's important? So he shared with us some great learnings, some examples of how it's definitely possible. And he was talking about making sure that it was inclusive. So those smaller communities maybe that have a great tourist destination, or maybe aren't large, they need charging stations too. And not only for their own benefit, because those residents eventually will have more and more EVs, but visitors to that area. So it's a good tourist attraction, or it's a good drive for those it's a good reason for those drivers who have electric vehicles to come and visit. So that tourism, and that's, our area is clearly highly, there's a big opportunity for tourism, not only for the games, but just ongoing activity, especially this time of year, any time of year. I love driving around any time of year. And so finding ways to do that, because that's something that will persist, right? That's beyond just the games. And so he also shared some design ideas from Rural Network. So you can see more detail because he's got some charts and graphics related to this. But, thinking about ways to site the individual charging stations, like on intersections, to make it easier in terms of flow of traffic. And one of the things that he also shared is in the wintertime, it's critical, of course, to have additional access to charging networks, from a snow removal perspective, from an equipment being available and in working condition. And if, for instance, the DC fast charger is paired with a level 2 charger, making sure those are all in one place. So if for some reason one isn't working, then another one will. So that way those drivers have that reliability factor of getting around. So those are the 4 presentations we had. Really good Q&A at the end. And what came out of that were some key insights as well for us to consider. One is, let's think about the users. And so of these EV charging stations, which means drivers, if it's passenger vehicles, if it's individuals coming to the games, or traveling around for work or for pleasure, the region. And of course, the other types would be the commercial vehicles, whether it's delivery or electric buses or transit, something along those lines. So think about what are those user needs, where do they go, especially in the more rural areas. That reliability and redundancy of equipment is key. We want to make sure that when you get there, because there won't be maybe a lot of other options for charging, that it works and that it's available, and that it's reliable. And from a wintertime perspective, we know that there's a little bit of a degradation in the total distance that you can drive an EV just because of the cold weather. So we want to make sure that when you get to those destinations, that the stations are there, they're rugged, they're durable, they're winter ready, and that they, again, have that ability to provide the service they need to. The tourism, I think we looked at the different corridors that people would travel from around the area or from major cities to come visit the area or passing through, and thinking about that as a way to really drive tourism and support those regional activities. So we even talked about the concept of maybe, the Montreal to Adirondack corridor, making sure that there's charging the whole way. We talked to also the thing to consider is that managing peak demand and making sure that the infrastructure itself not only can handle demand if everybody charges, but trying to spread that out a little bit. So how do we make sure that those not only the management of the energy usage, but also the costs associated with that is thought through. And then one of the final areas, and this is no surprise, is trying to make sure that we capture as much funding as possible for the region from these different opportunities that are limited time, right? Whether it's the $700 million that's getting spent statewide to the national grid programs, the VW settlement funds and tax incentives. And these are things we want to make sure we capture for the region. And so we have to get on it. So I'm super happy to have ANCA and the whole team here bringing everyone together to make this possible. And then finally, the road forward here we have, it's a good, it's an on-ramp, right? We're doing the on-ramp to the road forward. Yeah, we talked about earlier, and this is a build off from the first working group, is what are the type and number of electric vehicles used during the games and the infrastructure needed to support those vehicles for the games themselves, but thinking long-term. So working with local planners and utilities to see that the infrastructure can support the games, but also the resident and tourist needs. So let's think both ways. So we have the stats on the games, those are coming together, but then let's do that local planning to make sure that it fits the needs. So we don't have a lot of infrastructure in some place that isn't going to be used most of the year. And this temporary charging solutions, I think, Joel, to your team there at NAmTrans and others, you asked what can you guys do? If there's any technologies on the short-term mobile temporary solutions, that'd be a great thing to talk about, so that we don't have to overbuild in certain areas, and that would mean that we'd have to underbuild in other critical areas. We probably don't want to have to do that. And then making sure that those charging station solutions are ones that are as cost-effective as possible. So with that, that's the summary of our session, and look forward to any questions or discussion later.
All right, Ben, thank you for eloquently summarizing your working group. Let's see, and no doubt that we need to think strategically when siting these assets in the future and start that planning now. So it's always good to get reassurance and hear folks say that the timing is right for on-ramp and that we're getting this process going. And definitely, very happy that we've been involved with it so far. So before we jump into our next summary, we did have a question come into the chat box. I will let our next presenter do his summary presentation real quick, and then maybe we can try and address that question before we jump into the local benefits panel discussion. It just seems more relevant to try and address that question before we move on. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Noah Shaw. He's from Hodgson Russ LLP and also sits on ANCA's board of directors. He moderated the working group number 3 on local infrastructure challenges, both capacity and some opportunities. And he is here to share his thoughts and do a quick recap on last week's session. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Noah, if you're ready to go. Noah, do we have you on the line?
He may be still muted. Can you unmute him?
Let's see. Looks like he's unmuted now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, I was could not mute myself. That was good. But thank you for releasing me from my prison there for a minute. Okay, so working group 3. I will try to go quickly and make up some time, Jerrod. This working group was really about the grid, which was sort of a broad topic. But in the end, what we tried to do was to build up from the regulatory landscape starting in Lake Placid, which has its own electric department, which is unique, all the way up through how the North Country system works and what feeders and infrastructure is available in the North Country, and then with the overlay of what's going on at the state level in terms of regulatory changes and what we know from the broader policymaking discussions about what sorts of tariff provisions, that is sort of the rate structures for how electricity is sold and what the charges are and different configurations and what we can do both at the local and state level to help encourage the infrastructure being built out in terms of the direct current fast chargers, the DCFCs, which is what everybody needs in order to really see this expand over the course of the next few years, in addition to folks being able to install chargers in their homes. So next slide, please. Kimball Daby from Lake Placid Municipal Electric Department came and talked about the system that he has right now. It's allocated 29 megawatts of hydropower each month from NYPA, serves much of North Elba. Peak demand is during the winter, in part because, which is not common really across the state, but because of ORDA, and ORDA being a large customer of Lake Placid Municipal Electric, that is the way their system runs. So something that certainly needs to be taken into account. And the impact, and he talked a little bit about the impact of EV charging infrastructure not yet quite being clear. There are a couple of fast chargers that are either going in or plan to go in the village already, but there's a desire for a discussion about the rate structure to support those upgrades and the hardware that's going to need to be installed on the system to make sure that reliability is there and that we're not putting load onto the system that can't be supported. Certainly, Lake Placid will continue to work with NYPA in that regard. Matt Cloud, an engineer from National Grid, also was on our panel. Matt talked about the sort of broader system upgrades and rate structures that National Grid is working on implementing across the state. He talked a lot about National Grid's programs under the Make Ready order that the Public Service Commission issued earlier this summer. Talked about the early coordination with utility companies really being necessary on both sides in order to get in front of the upgrades that are going to be needed to serve what will be an expanding customer base in the very near future. He, as all good utility engineers will, cautioned with respect to the issues that can come with quote unquote unmanaged EV charging and existing peak load and the need to ensure that the system is bolstered to handle those increases in charging, especially during peak time. That is when everybody gets home from work and turns on their lights and their dishwashers, et cetera, and the line on the graph spikes. He also talked a little bit about the current grid capacity in Lake Placid being enough to meet the needs, but large EV growth could pose a challenge. Next slide, please. France Lampron from Hydro-Quebec was also on our panel. France gave what I would call a very interesting case study about how Hydro-Quebec has made decisions regarding its build out of especially the DCFC fast charging infrastructure. It's a little bit different, obviously, with Hydro-Quebec because it's a vertically integrated situation. That is, Hydro-Quebec owns their distribution system, they own their wholesale electricity supply, and they own the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure that they're installing on their grid. So they can make these decisions, obviously, without needing to think about, obviously they need to think about their ratepayer cost, but they don't necessarily need to think about third and fourth parties who are involved with this. And they act at the direction of the Quebec legislature as a crown entity. So she laid out with a lot of interesting charts and graphs, which you can find in her presentation on the line that ANCA will provide. The decision making that they have made with respect to locational importance, with respect to reliability and responsiveness. She also talked a lot about, some of the lessons that they've learned, which seem kind of straightforward and obvious, but when everybody's talking about kind of wonky policy issues, can sometimes get lost in the mix. And that is, you have to have a plan for operations and maintenance. You have to have a plan to understand which of the stations aren't working. You have to have a plan for customer service in order for these systems not only to work, but for customers to want to use them. Those issues are really important to get in front of, in addition to figuring out time of use rates. So next slide, please. Zerai Hagos from the New York State Department of Public Service, who's running the policymaking process at DPS regarding rate structure and rate reform, I guess is probably a better way to put it, for the state, came and gave what I thought was a really good presentation about not only the sort of outlines of the make-ready order and how the $700 million is going to be spent, but also with respect to what the next sort of set of issues is with the department and with the Public Service Commission around time of use rates, around demand charges, around the cost structures that will drive, even beyond the incentives that are being provided, that will drive the growth of the industry and make it affordable and attractive, not only for third parties who want to install and own the charging infrastructure, but also for the customers who are looking to charge their cars and buses. One of the things that came up in his presentation was that in the mid-2020s, most analysts expect EVs will reach cost parity. And what that means is that basically the lithium-ion battery pack.
No, we lost audio on you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
That's better, yeah, thank you.
Which means that it's funny, my audio went out when I was saying exactly the same thing during our working group. It must not like to hear
like that line, yeah.
Basically means that an F-150 will be about the same price in 4 or 5 years, or could be the same price in 4 or 5 years electric as gas. And what that means is that the distribution system and the charging infrastructure system have to be there, because once the demand hockey sticks and demand and desire for these vehicles starts going through the roof, which will happen as soon as they're the same cost, because frankly they perform better and they're lower maintenance and they're lower cost over the lifetime of the vehicle, we have to be in a position to be able to handle that. Range anxiety is the #1 concern that Zerai, and I think we've all heard that Zerai talked about, which puts a premium on the build out of the level 2 and the DC fast chargers, and that in our state, in New York, the fast charging site selection is driven by the developers. Utilities obviously have a role and criteria need to be set, but the developers and the owners of the fast charging infrastructure, that is EVgo, ChargePoint, Electrify America, a few of the other big ones, will be deciding where these things get built, and therefore rate structure and interconnection criteria are very important. All right, next slide, please. One of the interesting things about our panel, I thought, was, Kimball from Lake Placid was very clear that he was there in order to learn. And, folks like Zerai and Matt Cloud from National Grid and France were providing a lot of information, lessons learned, regulatory dynamics to consider, and planning issues to take into account for Kimball, as trying to set the policy and set new rates for the Village of Lake Placid Electric Department, is thinking about how to handle this oncoming increase in use, not only related to the games, but related just to the general sort of increase in uptake of the technology. And so for the North Country and for the games in particular, we talked about the cost parity coming. We talked about resiliency for storms. So making sure that, for example, I think somebody mentioned the ice storm in 1998. How do we make sure that if that happens and the grid is down for a week or 2 weeks, that people can still charge their cars, that public transportation can still work, and we talked a bunch about critical infrastructure to ensure that that is provided for. And for the games, we certainly noted that current capacity in Lake Placid and in the surrounding areas is not enough to meet the predicted load, but large EV growth can pose a challenge. We talked about the increase in grid capacity is unlikely for Lake Placid. That is, you're not probably going to see a whole lot more electrons being fed into Lake Placid. And so how do we manage increased peaks, especially in the winter? We talked a little bit about co-location of battery storage and other peak demand management. So that is, if you put a battery co-located with a fast charger, you can make sure that you can shave that peak, if you will. You can make sure that the uptick in usage when people are charging is taken on by the electricity that's stored in that battery, as opposed to only being pulled off the grid. So we talked a bunch about solutions, and I'm hoping that Kimball and some of the other folks on our panel continue to talk about their planning processes as we move along. There was a question in the chat. Oh, sorry. Oh, are we done? One more slide. Road forward. So I'm not going to talk about this too much because I think we've already sort of been over these points. There was a question in the chat feature that I thought was interesting to address, related to how we ensure that the increased load related to electric vehicle charging infrastructure is not served by dirty carbon generating electricity, which is obviously one of the most important considerations, not only with respect to the increased electricity that will be required for vehicles, but also buildings, right? If we're going to get to the state's goal of pre-industrial emissions by 2050, we have to have a pretty much almost completely electrified building sector, which means electric heat and electric cooling, and we have to have a nearly completely electrified vehicles sector. Now that goes along, obviously, with the state's goal of 100% clean electricity generation or electricity consumption by 2040. So those lines have to go together. In the North Country, we are lucky because the grid is also already extremely clean compared to especially downstate. If you read the NYSERDA and Department of Public Service white paper about how we get to 70% renewable energy by 2030, the big challenge is to try to make the rest of the state as clean as the North Country's. The North Country grid is mostly, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but I want to say like 75% at least, powered by hydro and wind and some nuclear. We don't have a lot of dirty generation in the North Country. The dirty generation from the state is mostly downstate. It's mostly gas plants and some of the peaker plants in the city, in Westchester County, Long Island. So, for purposes of sort of long-term policy making, but also having a little comfort that when you plug your car in, you're not being part of the problem. Here in the North Country, you can be confident that the electrons are as green as they get, at least for now, and they're only going to get greener. Okay, that is it for me.
Excellent. Thank you, Noah, for the brief but detailed summary and for fielding the question. So let's see, last but certainly not least, we have Eric Backus from Clarkson University, who is going to provide a quick summary on the community needs sessions that were hosted last Tuesday evening and last Friday afternoon. And then we'll jump straight into the community or the local benefits panel discussion. So Eric, if you are ready, I will pass the mic over to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Jerrod. Looking forward to sharing a little bit about our community sessions. Lexi, if you go to the next slide, please. So just to start off, we, as Jerrod indicated, had 2 sessions. One on Tuesday evening, where we really targeted, as it says on the slide, really general feedback across the community about transportation needs, and so forth, with really the goal of just trying to understand what is the panoply of transportation concerns, challenges, but also what's the visions and what are the assets that are available within the community to do this. We use a scenario-based exercise to do that. We started people off with a couple of them, you can read them on the slide, to allow them to kind of think about different types of folks that would be within the community. And then we really solicited general input. And this information was summarized in a quick fashion from this opening session on Tuesday evening into a several slide presentation that was submitted out to workshop participants, summit participants Wednesday morning, early in the morning, for kind of prior reading to get some sense of what the community or key stakeholders we had at this event. The event was, we had a good number of people. We had about almost 30 people at the event on Tuesday night. We did breakout groups. We were really able to get a lot of input from them, and that was great. We had a little concluding report out. Then on Friday, we also had another community session over lunch, which was intended to really see if we could get some snap reactions on the part of the community to what had been going on through the working group. So as part of that, I did a very brief, much briefer than we had today, presentation of the 4 working sessions, trying to just get very high points so that there's some sense of what was discussed through the summit working group sessions, both on cars, or on vehicles, I should say, the charging infrastructure, and then of course the broader grid infrastructure, thinking about electrification and clean technologies. So with that, we gathered some information, and I'll present some of this from what happened today. So next slide, Lexi. One of the things we started with was a quick opening stage center on Tuesday night, and I just want to share a little bit of that with you all this afternoon, or this morning, as we kind of conclude this, just as we especially get into kind of the local panel. Next slide, please. We presented several statistics. We did a little narrative about kind of what is the place that is the New York Olympic region, or the Central Adirondacks, High Peaks region of the Adirondacks, providing some sense of what's there, what we know about that. Next slide, please. We highlighted not just transportation, but also some of the housing needs, because one of the key things is connecting housing to transportation and how that works, both in terms of the long term and in terms of short term, things like rentals and seasonal homes. Next slide, please. And then we concluded talking about what we have been working with specifically in the Lake Placid community, but this also has a great correlation to the recent announcement of bronze certification for climate smart communities in Saranac Lake, about these sustainable holistic planning systems, specifically in this case, LEAD for communities, which the Lake Placid, the New York Olympic region, including ORDA, is a participant in, where they recently received gold certification back in December of last year, and are continuing in that program going forward. Next slide, please. So with this framework, what we try to do is just kind of lay out a few things about the place, and then we really wanted to focus the conversation around these kind of questions. What we think we know, and what's in the plans, what's in the documents that are out there, and where people are going, and trying to really understand their reactions to what they think might be the future for transportation in this key region of New York State. So next slide, please. So to summarize that, let me go into the kind of the next few slides to kind of give you some sense of what was talked about. First, a quick we introduced things. We had lots of different feedback from lots of different stakeholders, and it created a wide variety of input that I think is useful for this conversation. Next slide, please. First was understanding the tensions that are out there. What are the values and what are the goals that are within this? And sometimes they're not all congruent. There's obviously the concern about winter versus summer. There's thinking about the past and what was, and thinking about the future and what will be. And I think one of the key things on this is the idea of development versus preservation. The idea that this part of the world is a very unique, special place that has really strong underlying values and goals and things that are there. And as we think about where we're going, we don't want to lose the essence of what was and what is to what will be that isn't going to be the same as that. We want to keep the core part of that essence that's really unique and what makes the New York Olympic region, or this broader perspective, great, even as we look at new events like the FISU World Games. Next slide, please. So, one of the things is really thinking about all the variety of different needs, these goals and objectives. What is it going to look like for trailheads? I think many of us are familiar with the ongoing challenges of parking at trailheads, but is it parking, or are there other options we need to consider? What's the regional perspective? Is it just Lake Placid, or do we really need to think about this in a broader perspective, from all the way from Elizabethtown to Keene, all the way through Lake Placid to Tupper Lake and Saranac Lake and other towns in between? What's the relative thoughts about this? What are the different modes? Are they all going to be vehicular? We've talked a lot in this about clean transportation, but one of the cleanest kinds of transportation is the one that requires no fuel whatsoever other than our human energy. So what are we doing to do with that? And how can we make sure that these things are interoperable between getting in the vehicle, getting in that, and then getting out of it and getting around, because that's a key part of what is the central Adirondack region. And then this idea of what are the hubs and spokes? What are the places that we need to have as core gathering places for where transportation, vehicular transportation ends, and where other modes start picking up, and maybe transit in other modes. What are those places? Next slide, please. And then acknowledging that things are going to change. Things are changing over time. One of the things we're realizing is the challenges, and I think one of the things that Mayor Randall and Saranac, and Lake Placid would certainly say, is that one of his biggest challenges is that Main Street is really strained to meet all the demands that are going on there, whether it be streetscape, whether it be stormwater, whether it be other infrastructure, what's going on there, what's the mix of residents to workers, and what's the right mix for the community. And then dealing with the technology advancements, where that goes, but also what does that mean for the tourism industry, and what does it mean in regards to real estate and parking and other aspects. Next slide, please. They then really touched about this idea of seasonality. It's not that there isn't all across the time a straight line of kind of how things run. It's an up and down, an ebb and flow through the seasons, as we're seeing right now. It's beautiful in the central Adirondacks as we encounter all the change that is fall. This is one of the high seasons where people get there. They want to see what's going on. It's one of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. And so that's going to bring a certain, ebb, but a certain tide, and then it's going to ebb away. That's going to be, less for some period of time, and then it'll come back in the wintertime when the high, when we're really doing the outdoor activities. And then there's the idea of how do we look at alternatives and parking? How we look at what are the things to make that work, and then thinking about active transportation modes and how do you make those safe? How do we consider that in the same time we're thinking about changing the infrastructure for the future? Next slide, please. And then what we're talking about is one of the things we're living in is just the nature of capacity. The Adirondack Park has, of course, a distinct characteristic, and has distinct regulations that constrain the areas in which growth can happen. The hamlets are limited in where their geographic boundaries can be. So how does that work? How do we think about those with disabilities? How do we think about the challenge of sustainable transportation? What's the context? What does that mean in terms of how we got to think about transportation needs? Is it, as we were just talking about with the vehicles, thinking about going uphill in the middle of winter is a huge issue, thinking about the charging infrastructure and the vehicular infrastructure. How does that play into a lot of this? And then what are the capital that we have in there? Both certainly monetary, and that's certainly a big question, but also what's the human capital in the region? How can we take advantage of that and use that appropriately? Next slide, please. And then there's obviously unpredictable challenges. We're in the midst of one right now. I'm speaking from my home. Instead of being there in Saranac Lake, the Hotel Saranac, where this summit was supposed to be back in, was it April or May? And thinking about what is that doing? And then thinking about other things that are changing and other unpredictable challenges like lack of snow. And Mike Pratt will be speaking from ORDA here a little bit later and talking about the challenges that he has to maintain those facilities as a winter wonderland that we've come to expect out of the central High Peaks region. Next slide, please. And then thinking about what are the community assets, thinking about what are the things that are there that are great. Well, one is we have this wonderful downtowns. We have Saranac Lake, we have Lake Placid, we have E-Town, we've got the Keene Valley. These beautiful places that are really great assets. What are the ways to think about bringing people together? What about bringing folks across the border and thinking about how that can work? What are the ways we can think about schools, not just as modes for educating children, but thinking about how they have a transportation infrastructure themselves and how we could maximize that or utilize that in this picture of what we're thinking about both for the games, but broadly throughout the community. What's that look like? And then what's the different transportation modes we might need to think about? what are the ways we can emphasize those and bring those together in a way that will work as a true potpourri of options that people can take advantage of throughout the community. Next slide, please. So with that, there's some key takeaways that there's lots of things to be talked about. There's lots of things, lots of solution sets, but there's not yet a convergence on what the right mix is. We really need to understand this better. It's complicated. It's really challenging, but we have a lot of passion for this. There were a lot of people both on the Tuesday night session and on a Friday session, which I'll mention a few points about in a moment, that really have a strong sense that this is an important place. They want to make it great. It already is great. They want to make it even better. And so how do they do that? How can we do that without, again, losing that unique character and what makes the place special? We don't want to lose that special quality in the process of seeing progress. So how do we do that? But yet we recognize that even these sessions did not have everybody we wanted in the room. We need to reach out for others and really engage them. So next slide, please. So again, on Friday, we had a quick response. So Lexi, if you go to the next slide, we presented, as I said, some opening things about what was going on in the workshops. And here's some initial responses that came from that. One, the timeline seems really aggressive to the folks that we reached out to, that it just seems really concerning. Are we going to be able to engage and bring in this clean infrastructure? Are we going to be able to really get a start on it in a meaningful way? Are these vehicles being talked about as in addition to or in lieu of? Because if we have more traffic, that doesn't solve our problem. So we got to think about this in terms of what is the overall transportation plan. As you see here from both Diane Fox and from Lori Fitzgerald, I think two really key quotes about what they're thinking about, that we really need to think about this as a piece of a much larger picture about what we're talking about within this region. And how do we make that work for everybody in a way that makes sense? And then thinking about not just kind of getting in from Albany and from Montreal, but also from the West. How about from Syracuse, Utica, Watertown, Kingston, Toronto? How do we get people into this region as we start thinking about it going forward, both for the games in the future and then back to the idea, where are the hubs, where are the scopes, what are the different parts of this that need to come together? So next slide, please. So what's next with this, just have some awareness, is that we did submit for a grant to support ongoing transportation discussions, the Civic Innovation Challenge, the National Science Foundation program. We submitted to get funding for a planning grant, and we're hoping that what's coming out of this summit will help inform that effort to plan the larger picture. We will hear at the end of October whether we get that grant, and then that would lead to an opportunity for up to $1 million prize to do some sort of pilot effort supporting our larger plan going forward. So we'll certainly be in dialogue with you going forward, both with ANCA and Clarkson. We're leading this together, and we're looking forward to doing that in the future. So with that, I think, Jerrod, I think one last slide is just what are your questions? But thank you so much for your time to have an opportunity to engage the community and bring them into this conversation.
Eric, thank you so much for that very comprehensive summary. There's a lot of lines of thinking and discussion that you had to pull together, and certainly appreciate you taking a step back, zooming out and expanding the lens at which, through which we're looking at this, and just kind of challenging our thinking and our concepts. So I just want to say thank you actually to all of our moderators who provided us some today and for your time last week. Certainly it was a pleasure working with you and coordinating this, and we really do appreciate the time and energy and effort that you put forth to bringing this thing together. So we're going to change gears a little bit here, and I just want to be conscious of the time. It is now 10:53, and we have you until 11:30, but we want to leave time for a robust and enriched conversation with our panelists. So we're going to move into that section of the session. And before we get there, I'm going to introduce our moderator. And this is Kelly Chezum. She is a board member for ANCA and leads Clarkson's comprehensive integrated marketing, communications, and external partnership initiatives, and has stewarded the university's long-range planning activities since 2003. She is also Assistant Secretary of the Board of Trustees, serving as the professional staff liaison to the corporate officers and members of the board and its executive committee. Dr. Chezum has contributed to the development of a plan for international tourism opportunities, including the International Children's Games and World University Games. Dr. Chezum was the Director of Corporate and Foundation Relations during the last campaign for Clarkson, where she made numerous alumni and partner connections and collaborated with faculty and staff to raise more than $77 million in private support. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. The floor is yours.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome, Adirondack North Country colleagues, friends, neighbors, and advocates, of course, as well. I'm going to put you all a little bit on the spot, maybe, and ask you either to, we're going to ask a few opening questions just to get us started. So either be ready to hit your reaction button in Zoom or turn your video on and give me a little bit of a thumbs up on a few things here, because as Jerrod said, I am on the Adirondack North Country Association board. I've been on there going on going past nine years on there, and I can't think of a better organization to have this conversation. But just to get some audience participation here, just like we would if we were in person, I need to know how many of you have driven on the Northway, any part of it, that 4-lane highway from Albany to Montreal. Can I get some reactions with our, thumbs up buttons, etc.? Very good. How many of you have been at a movie theater in the North Country? Very good. And then let me ask, how many of you have been to a farmer's market or used a lot of local resources? And then now let me ask this. How many of us have seen an electric vehicle charging station? And then how many of us have used one? Now, the reason why this is all relevant and the context here is that ANCA started 65 years ago in 1955, and its purpose was a group of people that came together, public, private, government, citizens, businesses, to build the Adirondack Northway, to make the public case for it with our federal government and with the state of New York, that we needed good access into the Adirondacks and the North Country regions, and this organization helped make that happen. This organization is one that helped local movie theaters, when technology changed, make the transition to go to digital. So that was part of our Go Digital, Go Dark campaign, for those of you who may remember that. We've been a longtime part of local grazing plans, helping local entrepreneurs build a more sustainable workforce, and through initiatives like the Adirondack farming initiatives that we've had. And this is right up our alley as well. How can we help build a clean energy network, transportation network for our region here? That, as it was mentioned earlier, this is one of the special places on the planet to really live, learn, study, and steward the natural environment here that we so much care about. We have had an opportunity over the last 6-7 days now, I get 5 different sessions, to really hear a lot about the ideas that our colleagues have on the clean energy transportation network. And our panels here on the local benefits session, I love it was summed up in one, couple of very easy words like, so now what? We have all of this information, so now what? We have with us 5 panelists to kind of give their perspectives on what they've heard so far. I will say it wasn't in my bio, but I don't know, here too, on your thumbs up version, getting more involved. If you know where Dyersville, Iowa is, I actually am an Iowa farm kid, even though I've lived in the North Country now 27 years. Dyersville is where the Field of Dreams was. My nieces and nephews still play sports and athletics in Dyersville against them. They aren't in that school district. But if you build it, they will come, came from that famous movie with Kevin Costner, and I hear a lot about that with the ideas that people have here today. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to each give a short view of what they have from this, and it's a terrific group. We've got Teresa Chezum Palin from the town of Keene. She's a town councilwoman there and has been the liaison to the Keene Bley Energy Committee. Keene have recently installed 2 EV charging stations to serve residents and visitors. And she's also a member of the High Peak Strategy Planning Advisory Group. I'll give it a little truncated on all of these folks, but I'm sure their full bios were in the materials that were out there. Jim McKenna is with us today. And I don't know, if you don't know Jim McKenna and have been in the Adirondack North Country, that's hard to do. But Jim is the president and CEO of the Lake Placid-based Regional Office of Sustainable Tourism, also known as Roost. He is the co-chair of the North Country Regional Economic Development Council and was really key to bringing the World University Games to our region. Stephen Bird is one of my colleagues here at the university. He's our professor in our political science and humanities and social sciences, and also affiliated with the Institute for Sustainable Environment at the university, as well as a research affiliate with the Positive Energy Project at the University of Ottawa, just across the border. His research and scholarship focuses on energy and environmental policy, with a particular focus on energy conflict, social acceptance of energy systems, and energy technology governance. And so he was part of the team that was very integral in bringing the lead for community certification to New York's Olympic region in our community up here in the Adirondack North Country. We're also joined by Mike Pratt, who in full disclosure is also a Clarkson parent. In his, doesn't always put that in the official bio, but he is the president and CEO of the Olympic Region Development Authority, ORDA, a public benefit corporation that many of us take advantage of every year through our the facilities that are part of the 1980 Winter Olympic Games, the ski areas, Whiteface, Gore, Belier, all of the Olympic sports complex, ski jumps, et cetera, have been, and the skating complexes are part of our ORDA network. And then my last person is on our panel is Ashley Walden with the Adirondack Sports Council. She's the director of the internal operations for the council. She's a retired luge Olympian and very familiar with the athletes that come into to need our services and use our venues here. And the Sports Council mission is to promote, encourage, and foster the public's knowledge and interest in national and international sports competitions. And she is currently focused on the World University Games. So without further ado, I'm going to, challenge the folks to give a short reflection on the local benefit. What did you learn from this? What do you think the long-term impacts on the region? And what does the community really, from your vantage, need to do to move forward? Teresa, should we start with you?
Sure. Okay, so I learned a ton from all of this. And my big takeaway is this is a pretty challenging goal. Obviously, it's very complicated. It's multi-agency and multi-municipality. It's going to be a region-wide effort in my mind. But I also think it's an attainable goal, and I think it'll come in stages. So having the World University Games as a sort of goal to get to for now is a good starting point in sort of trying to build out some of this infrastructure in preparation for those games, and then seeing it as the next step would be what happens after the games. And I think that's a really logical progression at this point. And in terms of Keene already does run a shuttle to the garden. We've already had conversations about would we ever be able to make that into an EV shuttle. And from what I'm learning here, it might be possible. There's a variety of vehicles available now. I know that it takes time to get one. You have to order early, but that's a really interesting possibility. The town of Keene has already done a shared service with the school in which they had borrowed our summer shuttle during the winter when they needed an extra vehicle for one of their sports teams. So there's potential for sharing opportunities there. And if it was an EV shuttle, it's even better. And then, the other option, the other piece of this as part of the High Peaks Advisory Group, there is going to be some type of shuttle for the High Peaks area for hikers. And I know that currently there are already some shuttle buses purchased. They're 24 passenger with wheelchair capability, wheelchair lifts. So those are already purchased, and they're internal combustion engines. But if that shuttle is successful, I would certainly think that a second round of vehicles would be really incredible to be able to shoot for EV for those. And that also has been part of the discussion. I think the reason that those buses EV buses weren't purchased in the first round is because of a timing factor. We were supposed to have that up and running this summer, but of course COVID sent it a little bit backwards. But there is the option, I think, for creating an EV infrastructure for the hiker shuttle bus system, which would make sense for a million reasons, but definitely for environmental air quality reasons, and perhaps to limit the crazy parking situation that we have along the highways that were mentioned earlier. And then other pieces that kind of popped out for me in terms of moving forward with a regional approach. I mean, it would be pretty ideal if Keene had a fast charging station, because we are kind of the last town right before the big climb to Lake Placid. And if somebody was coming from a distance and feeling low on charging and they were, facing that hill, they might need a spot to stop and get a quick charge. So that's I think Keene would be a natural fit. It also works with the long-term plans of possibly developing information hubs throughout the region for hikers, for visitors, for tourists. And I think part of an information hub would not only be access to public toilets and the like, but also an information. But yeah, maybe that would be a likely spot for charging infrastructure as well. So I think there's a tremendous amount of possibility. It's a bit daunting trying to figure out what the next step would be, but I'm pretty excited going forward. And so I'll turn it over to whoever's next at this point.
Thank you very much, Teresa. That's really great points on there. And I'm hoping that a couple of our colleagues that I know are on the call will later maybe chime in on some ideas they're seeing in the community on tourism, where EV charging stations are helping drive traffic to those venues, et cetera. But with next up on our panel is Jim McKenna, who is the president and CEO of Roost. Jim, do you want to share some of your thoughts coming out of the last few sessions that we've been all part of?
Sure. Thank you very much, Kelly, and really thank the whole ANCA team for putting this together. Kate, Nancy, Jerrod, and others, really excellent program throughout. And, just listening to Joel, Benjamin, Noah, and Eric, it just sort of sums it up for us. But, just to put a little, why the University Games? And it was really, the University Games, certainly it's a great event and it's going to be good and exposure and everything else, but it's really about building legacy and, building legacy, number one, but also regionalization. And I know we've talked about that in a lot of our different discussions, but clearly, if we look at it, housing was one of the areas. Right now, there's 2 housing developments happening in the time frame of the games, with the games as the goal, and that's both affordable housing and market rate housing. But when those are completed and the games are gone, it's going to provide housing for about 1,200 people in the region that is not there before. And the largest component of it is going to be about 80% lower carbon. So it's building on the theme as well. The venues was another legacy, and Mike will talk about that, but certainly that's happening. Brand legacy, certainly recognition of the Adirondacks sports and global, as you saw in Almaty, Kazakhstan, Dr. Chezum. It's a big event, and it's gets a lot of global exposure. But certainly the environment has always played in there. Our brand is tied with the Adirondacks in the North Country, and environmental causes and environmental missions are part of the game's legacy, we hope, as we move on. Transportation, probably if there's one area that we need a lot of work on in this region, it's transportation. We're a rubber tire destination where everybody's driving their car no matter where they go, whether they're a visitor or a resident. Getting some low carbon public transportation in place long term is something that's not only needed, it's really wanted. And if we're going to grow population bases, and because of COVID, there's a lot of talk, as we all know, about potentially remote workers coming to areas like this, but they're accustomed to public transportation. And some of the research that was done around the university game and potential audiences, certainly it's a younger demographic, and there's much more concern now about climate, much more concern about how they're going to help affect our future. And being in a position where we can offer low carbon public transportation throughout our region, I think is a key ingredient that's going to drive the economy long term for us, or really help get away from the rubber tire destination as much as possible, individual calls. You know, reducing car traffic is probably one of the best things we can do across our region to lower carbon. And if we can replace that with more EVs at all levels, I think we're in a good position. The games gives us sort of a target date to get some of this infrastructure in place. Is it possible totally? Not sure. Certainly public sector funding is affected now by COVID. How will that play out? But we have to build partnerships, and I thank ANCA for pulling this together, because it's the partnerships with the understanding of where we have to go. That's going to allow us to be successful. You know, the future's now, it's happening. Climate has certainly been, over this last year, climate has certainly been ramped up more and more. And we have the ability through the games to not only have a target date, but to show the world how you can do events, how you can do housing, and how you can do green transportation.
Jim, that's absolutely great. I think points that you've made across the board for us on all of those areas. And I think gives a lot of good public conversation today or into the future, depending on the time we have. Steve Bird, one of my colleagues at Clarkson, would you like to go next and just share your viewpoints on the sessions we've had?
Absolutely. And thanks everybody. Thanks to ANCA, and really enjoyed this conversation. I've been thinking about the university games as essentially as a catalyst, and a catalyst for adjusting to the energy transition, but also to thinking about transportation planning for the region. And the big challenge for me is I was really thinking about three different pieces. Visitors who come on a regular basis, sort of the steady flow, if you will, throughout the year, seasonals, that sort of thing. Day-to-day transportation operations and needs for the local community, which is critical and has to be paid attention to. And then the big, large-scale events that occur in the Olympic region. And we actually need to find solutions that address all three together. The second thing I'm thinking, I do a lot of work on transition. There's no doubt the transition is coming. 2022, there is the current expectation that EVs are going to be cost competitive with internal combustion engines, and that's going to start an S-curve of adoption that is going to ramp up. And we're seeing that beginning already in Southern California and a few other areas in the United States. And in terms of the North Country and the Olympic region, if we're caught behind that curve, it means that we're going to suddenly lose people who might be coming to us because there won't be the infrastructure there for them. So there is a real upcoming need, and we want to be ahead of that curve. But at the same time, we need to make sure that addressing that infrastructure creates benefits that accrue to the local community and that address local community transportation needs at the same time. The other big area that I came out with is really starting to think about transportation options in the area as multimodal or hub and spoke. This means thinking about parking, and it's parking as a transition to different kinds of options, and whether that's parking buses coming to the area and then transitioning to other things, or trains coming to Tupper Lake and then transitioning to rentals, right? We should be thinking about different kinds of transition points. Greater integration of the other local areas beyond the Lake Placid hub, whether it's Saranac or Elizabethtown or Keene or Tupper or Paul Smiths, right? But thinking about all of these areas as other kinds of hubs. And the development of really flexible systems that are based on real usage patterns. We heard a lot from community members who talked about systems that are in place that sometimes don't address their needs because it's a 1 hour or twice a day system that doesn't come when they need it to. I think there are opportunities to think about on-demand systems, not necessarily Uber, but those kinds of systems that use an app and use the kind of data and transportation management capabilities that we have now. Better uses for rental options, and that includes for bikes. I just went hiking in the backcountry yesterday, was climbing up on Slide Mountain and biked up to the garden parking lot because there was certainly no parking spots there. And looking at rideshare options and van pool options for workers, especially in addition to housing. So flexibility is really, really critical in all this. The benefits are huge, and they include for the local residents, fewer traffic jams, better access to community for the community residents so they can take advantage of Lake Placid as well as the other people who are visiting. And that means addressing needs for children, needs for the aged, needs for the disabled, needs for commuters and workers as well. It is challenging. So we need to think about this as an integrated planning solution. It can't just be electrification. It has to be thinking about sustainable transportation solutions as a whole. And we use the term holistic when we think about this. So bus, walk, commute, housing, hubs, zoning, all of those are part of the conversation. Second big concern is making sure that the locals are part of the conversation. And that can be challenging to do. Everybody's working, et cetera, but we're really focused on that. And then the last thing is we can do lots of stuff, but you have to have ongoing resources that stay in place. There has to be a plan for systems to take care of buses, to make sure that charging stations are maintained, that we have the human resources necessary to address any kind of changes or implementation. So it's not just about coming up with a plan, but a plan to have the resources available long-term, right? Not just for the games, but beyond. And that may mean that we don't have the resources to do everything at all. We've heard a little bit about incrementalism, but then we have to have a really effective and thoughtful discussion about triaging. What are the priorities? What are the things that we do right now? What are the things that are going to get us the most bang for the buck right away? And then the list that comes down, play on later. That's it. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Stephen. And, you know, I think just on, I've heard Mike Pratt speak before. I think he probably will touch on some of those areas that you just talked about in terms of the sustainability of the systems that we do put into place, because many of those do fall to ORDA and often in the infrastructure items that are there. So, Mike, I believe you're up next. If you would like to just share some of your thoughts from the session.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Thanks, everybody. It's nice hearing all the enthusiasm around the World University Games, and this is a massive event. It's going to be twice as big as the 1980 Olympics in terms of number of events and number of athletes, which is why we had to embrace the regional approach and work with communities in Saranac Lake and Potsdam and Canton and North Creek in order to pull this off successfully. From our point of view, the Olympic venues were all, 42 years old and needed a lot of modernization and TLC. We were given a tremendous opportunity to modernize these facilities, and we acted immediately, going through the secret process 8 different times, trying to get all our permits, dealing with forest preserve issues as well as lands of towns, and getting our permits to move forward. Our goals were to were very challenging with modernizing facilities that are all like cities with the infrastructure from substations and distribution lines and wastewater plants. But it's one of the biggest challenges was making sure that we sequenced improvements so that we never had a negative impact as we tried to address a carrying capacity in one component and make sure that it didn't impact others. And we were doing this all with balanced carrying capacities. We focused on our operational efficiencies and our sustainability. We have solar power purchase agreements of 5.3 megawatts for Gore and 2.6 megawatts for Whiteface. We have charging stations. in the 1980 Zamboni pit with lithium-ion Zamboni, and 6 stations at Gore that have been there for 2 years. And what's really nice is that community that's using those stations have a lot of courtesy and consideration, and will charge their vehicle for 2 hours and then go move it so someone else can use it. We're energizing charging stations at Whiteface and at Mount Van Hovenberg. There's a lot of other parts that we relate with the community, and we're trying to provide solutions. Hiking's another simple one where we're turning our venues into hiking centers, trying to provide some front country solutions to avoid backcountry problems, and welcome the hikers that certainly won't make it to the top of a high peak and probably shouldn't be parking on the side of a highway. So we're here trying to be part of the community. We're trying to make immediate improvements, but making sure that we're sustainable, that our improvements have real impacts and are tangible, and just being a good neighbor to everybody.
Mike brings up some very good points about the Adirondacks in the North Country are built for social distancing, and that we did see an increase in visitors across our region of people who were looking to more connect with the outdoors, and having a reliable transportation network would alleviate some of those concerns at the trailheads and other venues that we have here in the long term for us. I want to make sure we get to all of our panelists and keep to our time schedule. Our next panelist is Ashley Walden. And as Jim did say, I think I did make the trip to Almaty with the World University Games team. And so I know what huge amount of work she's got on her plate there. And we'll say too that Clarkson and the colleges in St. Lawrence County are looking forward to hosting hockey in 2023.
Thank you, Kelly, and really just want to thank Jerrod and Kate and everyone at ANCA for putting this this conference together. I know it's been a work in progress, and I'm glad that despite everything, we were able to pull it together virtually. Really, looking back to the beginning of this project, and since I've been involved, there's been a lot of talk about legacy and sustainability of the games, and outside of our desires and the big committee's desire to address some of these issues, it's also a requirement of FISU that we address issues with legacy and sustainability of the games. So when I started out with this project, I knew that part of the bid was a need or want to increase the transportation network here in the North Country to help meet some of the goals that have been discussed throughout this, and there was certainly a need and a want here in the community. As the conversations evolved, talking with Kate and other organizations, it became apparent that not only should we have an increased transportation network, but we should try and make it all clean transportation, all electric, in any way that we can. So as we started out, really from a games perspective, our thought was all of the vehicles. Tony shared with us the number of buses needed in private vehicles and mini shuttles and kind of the networks that we'll have in place. Our focus really then honed into how can we make this all electric? How can we do this just for the games? But then coming back to the long-term, legacy of these games, how can we leave some of this infrastructure in place that can benefit the community long-term? And then looking at these pieces, our question became, how is this possible? Can we not only do this for the games, but can we have it there long term? And if so, how do we do that? I think that this conference for me has really brought to focus what the possibilities are. And not only the possibilities, but the support and the interest from organizations across the state, even across the border up into Quebec. And that for me has really helped take away some of the anxiety that we had about making a commitment or trying to dedicate this clean transportation for the games. Then looking at that, looking at some of the incentives, some of the New York State goals, tying all of these pieces together, more and more it makes sense that we have to do this and we have to make this a target, not only for the games. And Jim mentioned earlier, that the benefit of doing this for 2023 is that it gives us an end date. It gives us that milestone and the goal that it has to be done by, hopefully accelerating some of the projects that have been on the back burner for a little bit. So for me, we look at now, how do we make this happen? From the Sports Council, procuring vehicles for the games, that's a responsibility of ours. So whether that's electric or whether that's gas-powered vehicles, that's something that we have to do. So now if we're looking at all electric vehicles, and this is outside of the infrastructure, now from this, from the summit, we've been able to make connections and have some leads on where we will address the procurement of these vehicles. From an infrastructure standpoint, knowing what the need is, when we work with the athletes housing, we work with Mike Pratt and Orna, we'll need charging stations. Are they, is there an opportunity for them to be there long-term? Does it make sense for them to be at certain places long-term? Where can we have, somewhat affordable or just, beefing up for the needs of the games? And then where do we keep that long-term? But really, I think, the biggest takeaway and what I really kind of want to rally behind is that let's use the games as the opportunity. Let's use this as the launch pad, not only to get these projects done in time, but then also to spotlight and showcase them for the games. Because it won't just be the region, it will be international. And let's showcase really how all of these things can be brought together in a small rural community and how we can showcase those benefits long-term. And I think it's important messaging not only for the community, but from the sporting event world, New York State's climate goals, it ties all these pieces together. And I just really want everybody to keep in mind that we are extremely supportive. We want this story to be heard, and we want everybody to use the games as a spotlight so that we can influence not just this project, but others in the future. So Kate, Jerrod, everybody at ANCA, thank you very much. We truly appreciate the opportunity to participate in this and all the work that you've done to pull all the right stakeholders together.
Thank you. And I want to reiterate too my thanks to Kate, Jerrod, Nancy, the entire staff team at the Adirondack North Country Association for pulling this conference together, and all of our panelists that we had such a great turnout. I know some people do have conflicts for 11:30. I don't mean to cut anybody off from questions. I am sure that if you submit those to Jerrod, he will get them to the panelists, and we can get some follow-up perhaps in all of the panelists that have been throughout the conference. I'm sure he can get those back out to the interested parties. I think, as you said, Ashley, too, this is very much a good networking and seeing what the capabilities and knowledge is in our community here. And I can just reiterate too, the local benefit, I think, what is so special about what we're working on is that it impacts residents, it impacts long-term visitors, and I mean long-term visitors in terms of college students that come live with us for 4 years. There are 13 colleges in our Adirondack North Country Association area. And then, the people that just want to come back and be a part of visiting here on a more regular basis. So it brings so many threads together, I think, for our regional economy, as well as stewards just some of the most beautiful land and landscapes in the world right here in the Adirondack North Country. So, and I didn't see anybody add any questions to the chat box. So Jerrod, do I turn it over to you or to Kate right now?
Sure. Yeah, Kelly, I'll take it. Thank you, Kelly, for moderating this last round of discussion. And I just want to give one more shout out to all of our moderators and all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and participation and really thinking through a lot of these issues and concepts. A lot of ground was covered over the past week or so, and certainly appreciate people sharing their knowledge, their perspectives, and how they can move this conversation forward. Also want to give a big thanks to all the attendees and participants, everybody who tuned in each day and provided engagement and focus throughout the session. Thank you so much. It was, we had great turnout, and it was great to see all the numbers pop up each morning as we opened up the call. And also a big thank you to the ANCA staff. All of them contributed so much to this event. It's it's going on a year that we started planning this. Last October, we began conversations with folks, and it's been an absolutely fabulous team to work with. They've been phenomenal and professional throughout the whole thing. And just, you wouldn't believe the amount of work and communication that has gone into making this thing come off without a hitch. And also a thank you to Kate Fish, ANCA's executive director, for her leadership and vision in starting this whole conversation about this time last year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kate to close out the session and close out the event. So Kate, it is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to say thank you and offer some recognition. One, thank you again to the sponsors of the event, without whom this couldn't happen. And I want to reiterate what Jerrod said. The ANCA Energy team and the other folks at ANCA are absolutely incredible and have done an amazing job in pulling all of this together, using all of our networks to bring a really incredible set of presenters and people who bring the kind of expertise around the table. So kudos to the ANCA staff. Again, you guys did an amazing job. Jerrod, Nancy, Jen, Audrey, Lexi, all of those who were involved. It's an amazing team. I'm very proud to work with you. I also want to say thank you to our panelists, but also our agency partners, I think, and Clarkson University for helping pull this together. I think that we all can say that we stand ready to work with Ashley, with you and your team, to, with the region, to provide whatever resources we can to make this happen. So I think it was a great opportunity to kind of make those connections, and we again stand ready to help facilitate that process. And as Jerrod said, thanks to all who participated. It was great to see how transitioning from a in-person event that was planned for April was able to go off without a hitch as a virtual event. So next steps, all these presentations and recordings will be posted through our YouTube channel, but via our website in the next day or so. And we are planning to reconvene in April, probably as a virtual session, given what's going on with COVID. And we'll be checking in with the planning to date, kind of bringing more resources to the table, and kind of carrying the conversation forward. So I think our energy team and everyone else needs kind of a week to catch their breath, and then we'll start thinking about the April event. So thank you so much. We really appreciate this. This wouldn't happen without all of your participation and the expertise that you bring to the table. Thank you.